All right, folks. Hope everybody's having a good weekend, spending time with your moms today, and celebrating Mother's Day. So we got two more sets of notes, and that'll be it for the semester. We'll have one today and one tomorrow. We're going to talk about today the movie industry, and then kind of some odds and ends to close things up tomorrow. So let's get right to it. Remember, you can include this stuff towards the end there with your guided notes. That's already up there, and we'll get right to it. All right. So the 1990s, the movie industry in the 1990s. I put that blockbuster video thing in there. I think one of the big cultural pieces of the late 80s and throughout the 90s was the popularity of video rental stores. They would be everywhere during the 1990s on street corners. There was many video stores as there were, Subway sandwich shops or McDonald's and things like that. Now you don't see them as much anymore. You got Family Video and a couple others here and there, but now with DVRs and streaming, nobody needs the rental store anymore. But they were a huge piece of the culture in the 1990s. Blockbuster Video, Hollywood Video, Movie Mart, all these other places. Um, so uh, the movie industry in the 1990s is really kind of an interesting decade for film, where we saw a lot of growth and more diversity in television as more cable comes around, um, as we see music do what it did during the 1990s in diversification. Movies, not as much. We start to really see for the first time um, with television pushing more boundaries before. In other words, you could find things in TV shows that before you could only find in movies. The movie industry has to respond. And, the challenges of the 1990s really made it kind of an interesting decade for movies in general. Um, I would say the 80s are a better decade for movies than the 90s. The 70s are. The 2000s and the 2010s, although, historically that's yet to be determined. 90s aren't a bad decade for movies. Some of my favorite movies come from this decade, but there's just a lot of little kinks that made it kind of just not perfect, right? A lot of the popular movies from the 90s, for one, haven't aged well. A lot of movies try to use CGI and things of that nature, but it's still kind of a new innovation, new technology at the time, so it doesn't really look that good. And if you watch some of these action movies from the 90s, where they have big explosions and other things and stuff like that, um, it just doesn't look right because they're still working on that technology. When they talk about the Marvel movies, a lot of times they've said like, they had been trying and planning to wanting to make movies for a long time, but the technology wasn't there. And the people at Marvel often joke, if we would have tried to do some of these movies in the 90s, it would have been a disaster. The talk in the 90s was, for instance, they were going to do a Spider-Man movie, but Tom Cruise was going to be Spider-Man. Like, that doesn't really make sense. Um, Talked about, I think, at one time Nicolas Cage being Iron Man. You might not even know who Nicolas Cage is, and that's a good thing, but he was huge in the 90s. So, those are things that just, would probably not have aged well or worked well. And that was a big problem for 90s movies. If we look back at a lot of them, some of them are really, really good, but a lot of them don't age particularly well. Again, because CGI was kind of a new thing that was being used. Now, it worked well with animated films like Toy Story. Toy Story was the first movie to ever be made completely by computer, by computer generated images, right? CGI. So that was groundbreaking for the time. You can do that with animated films, but not live action stuff, and certainly not with the special effects and things that people are capable of today. Now we start to see, um, just like uh, just like in sports in the 1990s, salaries for movie actors and actresses grow tremendously during the 1990s. Jim Carrey becomes the first actor ever to get paid $20 million for being in one movie, right? I believe some of the highest paid actors now, it's like, I think Robert Downey Jr. got like 50 million for um, Avengers. Daniel Craig got 50 million for being in the last James Bond movie. So now, actor salaries are crazy big, and those are just some of the examples of some of the biggest ones. But Jim Carrey becomes the first actor to make 20 million for a movie. So we see kind of along with athlete salaries growing in the 90s, the same thing's happening for celebrity actors. So we see Hollywood pour a lot of money into movie making. So if you think about it, make these big budget films. So you got to spend a lot of money on special effects. Then you also have to spend a lot of money on getting the actors and actresses. If I want to make my big Terminator movie, I got to get Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's going to cost me 20 million there, plus all the money for effects. They have to cut money in other places, and unfortunately, for a lot of movies, not all movies, but a lot of movies from the 1990s, those cuts come in the form of writers, directors, and the ability to produce these stories that are ultimately going to be very endearing and good, and are going to really hold up for an extended period of time. Another thing we see happen in the 1990s, kind of the reemergence of the disaster film, most notably Armageddon from 1998, where there was a asteroid that was going to hit Earth and kill everybody, and Ben Affleck's there with his girlfriend's dad, who's Bruce Willis, and only one of them can survive, and it's just it's all sad and everything. Titanic is obviously another example of a disaster movie based in reality to a certain degree, and that, of course, is the biggest movie ever made. At least it was to that point. So we get some big ones in the 1990s. We see the disaster-oriented films are popular, and there's other ones. And of course, that's a recycled concept that was popular in the 70s. And I mentioned before the popularity of the video rental store, which comes into play largely during the 1990s. Right? Okay. So, what type of movies are people going to see in the 90s? Well, early in the 90s, one of the popular types of realistic films were films that depicted life in the inner city or life in the gangs. Movies like Boys in the Hood is probably the most notable one that expresses life in what life is like for young African American men living in like Compton and in Los Angeles. In fact, Ice Cube, who was a member of NWA, that was one of the stars in this film. Menace to Society is another example. New Jack City with Wesley Snipes. Above the Rim, Tupac was one of the stars of this movie, which was about gang life, and there's a main character who's a really good basketball player. So like the gang guys are trying to protect him from becoming part of the gang, so he can make it to the college and maybe beyond that for basketball. And so in the early 90s, we see a lot of movies that depict kind of the inner city life and the temptations of a gang lifestyle too. John Singleton was a famous director, no relation to Zoe or Zach, but John Singleton was a famous director of these films in the 1990s. He passed away recently, but really expressed, especially to the white moviegoer, some of the realities of life in the inner city during this time. In terms of complicated stories, we actually get that a little bit of a move, a little bit away from the high concept stuff of the 1980s, although those were still popular. Psychological thriller films became really big during the 1990s. Silence of the Lambs, of course, is one. The movie Seven, Fight Club, The Sixth Sense, Usual Suspects, even The Shawshank Redemption, I guess, would be an example. These films that are classic films that force the film viewer to really think about it, and then there's always some massive twist at the end that you weren't at all prepared for. Like for instance, if you watch The Sixth Sense, if you've seen that movie, Bruce Willis is with the boy Haley Joel Osment, and he's sees dead people, and Bruce Willis is the guy that talks to him, but nobody thinks that Bruce Willis is one of the dead people until the end, and all of a sudden they're like, whoa, he's one of the dead people from this movie. So movies like this that we see really popular in the 90s that have these, that tell these pretty good and well-written stories, and then have these kind of left turns at the end of the movie that kind of change the whole direction. They're all really, really good and well done, and really a thinking person's movie in many respects. We of course still see big budget action films during the 1990s, but we see the emergence of new action stars in the 90s. You still got guys like Sylvester Stallone, who's in movies like Cliffhanger, and Schwarzenegger, who's in movies like Terminator and True Lies and ones like that. But you see new action stars emerge, like Keanu Reeves, Nicolas Cage, Will Smith, who's in the Bad Boys movies, and then Nicolas Cage is in those. This is a Keanu Reeves film. So big budget action films are big. Again, very similar to what you would see today or what you would have seen in the 1980s. But then they're still fan favorites. They're still escapist. There's still escapist enjoyment, and people are going to go, still going to go see these type of movies. High concept films in the 1990s. Again, these are the movies that you can pretty much describe the story in about a sentence. The examples of this would be movies like Jurassic Park, The Matrix, Men in Black, a movie about Indecent Proposal, which you're probably not familiar with that one. Starred Demi Moore, and it was a movie about how this husband and wife wanted money to buy a new house. Or or something. I don't remember. It's been a long time since I saw it. But they wanted money for something. So this really rich guy basically um, offered this guy and his wife money so he could spend the night with the guy's wife, but then they would get the money that they wanted for their future. So it was all about the moral dilemma of that. The Truman Show, which is a Jim Carrey movie in which his whole life is like kind of videotaped and he's living in this bubble and he doesn't really know it. So high concept films are still really, really popular during the 90s. Teen films kind of come and go during the 90s. Of course, they were really big in the 1980s with the Brat Pack and Breakfast Club and 16 Candles, Pretty in Pink, movies like that. But then they kind of fall out of popularity. Ferris Bueller, until the late 90s, where we start to see the resurgence of films like American Pie, Can't Hardly Wait, She's All That. Um, Basically, they have a similar story. There's a couple guys, a couple girls, usually somebody geeky in there. Um, and a lot of themes around wanting to have sex and stuff of that nature. Um, One thing that's kind of a teen film that kind of takes a different direction is Scream, which is actually a horror movie, but it kind of is a lighthearted horror movie in the sense that it kind of makes fun of the genre of horror films and focuses more on kind of the teen aspect, which was groundbreaking for the time period. Another thing that was commonplace during the 90s was we saw a lot of movies that addressed serious themes that film had not really addressed before. We talked about this before with the gang life and inner city films, but we also see movies like these that address kind of really serious issues that that have been kind of taboo topics or things that people have been afraid to look at. Dances with Wolves is a great movie from 1990, Kevin Costner movie that talks about really delves into Native Americans and the circumstances Native Americans had to deal with as they were being forced out of America. Schindler's List, of course, deals with the Holocaust and the horrors of that, which is a topic that movies had really been apprehensive to really get into. And then Philadelphia. Philadelphia is probably the first great film that features a HIV positive main character who also happened to be gay. And he's dying of AIDS and he loses his job because of it and it becomes this big thing. Tom Hanks played the main character in that movie, won an Oscar for it. So we're seeing films deal with Native American issues, the Holocaust, inner city issues, and AIDS in more serious ways than ever before. Other films had mentioned things like this in the past, but never really directly handled them like we see during the 1990s. You got here some of the biggest films of the decade. Jurassic Park was, everybody was talking about that when that movie first came out. I remember that in 1993, like it was the biggest movie ever. And then this movie, Independence Day, comes out in 1996, and then that was the biggest movie ever. That movie's terrible, by the way. Pretty in Pink is what made Julia Roberts a star in the 90s. The Lion King, of course, one of the best Disney movies. Home Alone was huge. Christmas movie. Terminator 2, American Pie, that was a little bit later. Titanic, of course, becomes the biggest movie of all time. And you can't talk about the 90s without including Forrest Gump in that discussion. So, all some big movies from this. So, some of the big milestones of the 90s. For one, 1991 Terminator 2 Judgment Day becomes the first movie to cost over $100 million to make. A lot of that going into salary and things like that for Arnold Schwarzenegger, and its use of CGI and stuff like that made it really groundbreaking for its time. This was a huge movie that everybody in 1991 was talking about. 1994, we see Forrest Gump and Shawshank Redemption. They both come out the same year. They're always on TV now. They're like probably the two movies from the 1990s that everybody's seen and everybody pretty much likes. Although I can't handle Shawshank Redemption. I don't know why I can't sit through it anymore, but I've seen it, so I know what happens. But anyway, so that was kind of 94 was a huge year for movies, probably the best of the decade. In 1995, I mentioned this before, Toy Story becomes the first full-length film that was completely animated by computer, CGI. So we see that kind of as a new innovation. So that's a big deal. Other big deal from the 90s, right? In 1997, Titanic becomes the first movie to gross over $2 billion at the box office. Would be the highest grossing film of all time until Avatar beat it out in 2009. And now it's third because Avengers last year topped that. So, and then finally, we kind of close out the decade with the beginning of the new Star Wars with the prequel trilogy, probably the worst film of all the Star Wars movies, Phantom Menace, with the first film of the prequel trilogy, which really gets Star Wars back into people's consciences, and that's a big deal. Star Wars was huge in the 80s, not so popular as much during the 1990s, but when they re-released, or when they got in the process of starting to make the new Star Wars movie and started re-releasing the old ones to the theater, then Star Wars interest picked up again, and now all kids are growing up with Star Wars and stuff. But I really didn't as much as some other people. So, so these are some of the big moments of the 90s. Proud to say I've never actually watched Titanic. I know a boat sinks, so I guess it's a high concept film. Anyway, there you go. So what are some of the biggest stars in the 90s? And they don't have to necessarily just be movie stars, but they're prominent figures from the decade here. So for one, of course, you have Tom Hanks, who is certainly the most popular and successful actor of the decade. His movies everybody would go see: Forrest Gump, Castaway, Apollo 13. He was actually nominated for 4 Best Actor Oscars during the 1990s. He won 2 of them. So he's the most decorated and most popular actor of the decade is Tom Hanks. He had a wide range. He was in many comedic films as well as more serious roles. Julia Roberts. Julia Roberts and Demi Moore, actually. I'll write that name down because she's not on the list here. Were really groundbreaking in terms of arguing for female salaries in movies. By the mid-1990s, Julia Roberts in particular, and also Demi Moore, were making more money per film than any other actress has ever had before, and they're very groundbreaking in terms of making the argument for female salaries for female stars being as high as the salaries that the men make, which is of course kind of a big step in the right direction for women's recognition in the film industry. So Julia Roberts, Demi Moore, 2 of the biggest female names. Another one, of course, is Brad Pitt, who played a lot of different types of characters in the 1990s, as you see with a lot of young actors that are in their 20s and 30s, and particularly ones that are like good-looking guys like Pitt or whatever. They play a lot of different type of roles, so they can be seen as kind of wide ranging in terms of their skills before they become the people that get sought after for movies. You see, the biggest actors, the best ones out there, the Tom Hankses of today, and the Brad Pitts and people like that. Um, Screenwriters will write scripts with them in mind to play the part. But younger actors, they just want to find their way into Hollywood, and they don't have parts that are written for them. They have to adjust to the type of actor or acting that is needed to play a character. Okay, so you see guys in the '90s like Brad Pitt and some of these other younger ones that are going to play a lot of different types of characters to try to find that niche so they can become, kind of the big name person that people are going to be going after to play certain roles. And Pitt, of course, is really popular in this regard. And, during the latter part of the decade, he's kind of like the hot actor, sexiest man alive type guy. He also, of course, had a relationship with Jennifer Aniston in the '90s and early 2000s. Jennifer was certainly the biggest female TV star of the 1990s, and then that kind of translated to a film career later in the decade. She was popular in setting fashion trends and hairstyles and things of that nature, and was, of course, kind of the main character. Well, they're all equally main, but probably the most noteworthy character or the biggest star that was on the show Friends, as that was, blowing up throughout the 1990s. Nicolas Cage, I mentioned him before, which was weird because he was kind of the biggest action star in the '90s in a lot of terrible movies like Con Air or Face Off, which Face Off was okay, and then pretty good movies like The Rock, but he kind of sucks. So it's kind of weird that this guy was like the big action star of the '90s, but whatever. It was the '90s. Jim Carrey, I mentioned before, was one of the big comedy stars of the decade. Becomes the first actor to get paid $20 million for a film. I think it was for the movie The Truman Show in like 1997. So at that point, he's the highest paid actor in Hollywood. Other names of the '90s included Will Smith and Denzel Washington, African American actors who are very different. Denzel Washington plays again a lot of different roles and is very highly regarded as an actor. Will Smith, becomes famous as a rapper and then transitions to the star of the TV show The Fresh Prince, and then by the mid '90s becomes this new action star in movies like Bad Boys, Independence Day, Men in Black, and films like that. So we're seeing more African American stars really make a big stamp in culture and in Hollywood during the '90s. Okay, so here are just a few pictures of some of our big stars from the period. Tom Hanks, obviously, one of his Oscars, I think, from Philadelphia. There's Nicolas Cage, he's terrible. Will Smith, him, and Denzel Washington. Julia Roberts, Brad Pitt, and Gwyneth Paltrow were in a relationship in the '90s. Some of the other stars here that became big during this time. You've got Demi Moore. I mentioned her before. Was a trailblazer in terms of arguing for rights for fair and equal salaries for women in film. Meg Ryan, who was a big star of a lot of romantic comedies. You got Sandra Bullock and Matthew McConaughey emerge as new stars kind of for the first time during the '90s. And then in comedy, you got the SNL guys and Chris Farley and Adam Sandler who come around during the '90s and are really popular. Of course, Sandler movies like Billy Madison and Happy Gilmore. And unfortunately, Chris Farley died way too young. But these are some of your big stars of the 1990s. Again, this was a little long. Sorry about that. We'll talk about it some more in class tomorrow. And that's that. I'll see you.